Okay, hello everybody. How are we doing tonight? As you may be aware, there have been some interesting development over the past several days that I thought it would be worth addressing. Number one, I have been getting quite a few comments over the past, I don't know, maybe a couple weeks or months, imploring me to go on the Tim Pool live stream. So I did that yesterday at his invitation, obviously. And I thought it was pretty interesting. It was all done in person, so I went to his abode and we sat there for I don't know how long exactly, 2.5 hours or so, and went through mostly election related developments. So if you want to access that stream, I suppose go onto his channel and attempt to find it. Somebody sent me the link yesterday, kind of as it was happening, and apparently the link was unlisted. So I don't know what the deal with that is, but I did tweet out the link um, this morning, so you can go look that up if you'd like to access it. Um, and the bulk of that discussion was taken up by going through these claims of voter fraud, which obviously Trump and legions of Trump supporters who are inundating me online believe vehemently has rendered the election illegitimate, corrupt, rigged, whatever. And I don't know exactly where to begin in addressing these claims because there are so many. One thing that the Trump campaign has done is that they've telegraphed what they were going to do vis-a-vis these voter fraud allegations. They said ahead of time that they were going to marshal all the resources at their disposal to do a full court press legally in the event of a Trump loss. Um, and, I think it's worth dispelling some of the maybe mystique around U.S. elections because, as you may know, if you've been following me, I was in Georgia on election day and in the and then a couple of days thereafter. And you may or may not be aware of this, but you, Joe Schmo or Jane Doe, as a member of the public, could, if you were interested, have just moseyed on in to any number of venues where the votes were being tabulated. You could have gone and observed it for yourself. I did. And I didn't seek any special media credentialing. I just went in as a member of the public and observed. There's a vote processing center in Fulton County where you could go and watch as Republican and Democratic observers adjudicated disputed ballots. Disputed meaning ballots that have been unsuccessfully processed by the computerized tabulation system. The Republican and Democratic observers, by the way, the fact that only Republican and Democratic observers are permitted in the process shows how deeply entrenched the two party system is in all facets of state election law. So, like, hypothetically, if some third party candidate, you know, had magically become viable in Georgia, somebody affiliated with either party would not have been statutorily permitted to go view and adjudicate those disputed or incomplete ballots. Anyway, that's a side note. But I went just looked at it happening. I mean, it wasn't hidden. As dysfunctional in a lot of ways as the U.S. electoral system is, that dysfunction isn't really hidden. It's available for all to see if they choose to, if they have the desire to. And so I think a lot of these fraud claims are kind of seizing upon a fundamental lack of awareness as to really what is the, in a way, admirable transparency of the U.S. election administration system. Again, I'm not saying that it's a flawless system. Far from it. I mean, the idea that we're still waiting on results from multiple states as of tonight, although the Decision Desk HQ just did call Arizona in Biden's favor, although it had been called on election night by Fox News, somewhat controversially, and also by the AP, but that looks to have been borne out. So Arizona has been called. But as of tonight, we're now 8 days later, and multiple states have not been called as of an hour ago. Georgia's still outstanding. And the United States is supposedly the most powerful country in world history, has these vast resources, the world's reserve currency, the most powerful military in world history, loves to go around the world lecturing other nations as to how they should conduct their internal affairs in relation to elections. Even at times topples governments and imposes democracy on unwilling subjects around the world. And then, most of the world should be laughing at the U.S., given how idiotic its election administration regimen is. I mean, it's not like computers were just invented. There ought to, you think, be a way to expedite this process so we're not all hanging around waiting on votes from Arizona. But a lot of the complication does stem from the fact that the turnout in this race was massive. It remains to be seen what the final estimate will be as to turnout, but clearly it's off the charts. There's a Wall Street Journal op-ed that came out tonight by Karl Rove, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. But he says that this election, 2020, saw the highest turnout for any presidential election since 1908. And, I'm not sure how exactly that comparison works, because there wasn't women's suffrage at that time, so who knows? Or at least universal women's suffrage. But anyway, clearly turnout had gone up by a huge rate. And you see that all across the country, and you see it across partisan lines. So it's not like it's even particularly heavily skewed toward the Democratic or Republican sides in terms of the turnout increases. For example, the latest estimate I saw from Maricopa County, Arizona, which is obviously the biggest county in the state by far, and one of the biggest in the entire country, turnout was 80%. That's the current estimate, and that's stratospheric. And so for Biden to have won by just something like 10,000 votes really is a narrow margin. And I don't necessarily blame people who have some ingrained skepticism as to the veracity of that result. I mean, look, you don't have to lecture me on how untrustworthy the media has comported itself. Untrustworthily, the media has comported itself over the past several years. I mean, I've been one of the people screaming the loudest about their extreme malfeasance and irresponsibility with regard to Russiagate, and I think that really has poisoned the well in terms of the credibility that the media has squandered and the lack of faith that so many Americans have, rightly, justifiably, in what the media is telling them. But when people object to me, they'll say, "Oh, you've been indoctrinated by the MSM." I'm not relying on the MSM to inform my election analysis. Like I'm not relying on pundits on MEC or something telling me what the truth is. I have access to the data myself right here on my computer. That comes not from the MSM, but from the Secretary of State who presides over election administration in Arizona. And by the way, the Secretary of State um, in Georgia anyway is a Republican. Everybody running the elections in on a state level in Georgia is a Republican. And the Attorney General of Arizona, I just saw earlier tonight, was going on defending the veracity of the election results, and he is a Republican. So I think if you hear these fraud charges kind of flippantly leveled, the question you should pose in response is, okay, so like to what, how far does the conspiracy go? Because it's got to be a multi-state conspiracy. And when if you're saying there's massive scale election fraud that could have tipped the election to Trump or to Biden, it's not enough for there to just be isolated incidents here and there, which are par for the course for any election. It's got to be something that's coordinated. There's got to be something, a systematic bias that was imposed fraudulently on election results from a variety of states, maybe even the entire country. That's really the only way that a fraud charge would be sustainable. And I think you see the unsustainability of those charges given the failures of the Trump legal effort to get any traction on their lawsuits. All they're doing is they're just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. There's nothing. There's no like logically consistent through line in what they're arguing in courts in all these jurisdictions. The most ridiculous one is this idea that mail-in voting violates the Equal Protection Clause because it creates a two-track voting system where different standards are applied to mail-in voting versus in-person voting. And if that's the case, then okay, that means Utah, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, which have been almost universally mail-in voting for years now, have been violating the constitutional rights of their citizens. I don't think that theory was ever even contemplated prior to November 3rd, 2020. And that logic would have been just as applicable to mail-in voting if Trump had won. So again, it doesn't make sense. They're just uh, again throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. And the problem is that Trump received fewer votes in multiple key states. Um, right. And so here's what I would say. You can continue to live in a fantasy world where Trump's victory is right around the corner. That's fine. All I'm going to say is I think you're inhibiting yourself from reaching a rational understanding of what the election actually signified. And notwithstanding Trump's defeat, I wouldn't view these results as especially vindicating of Trump's antagonists. Yes, they did succeed in defeating him, and obviously that's a massive psychic victory for them. But think about it this way: Trump clearly had most sectors of the financial, cultural, technological, intelligence worlds arrayed against him for 4 years with a nonstop drumbeat of hysterical propaganda, most of which was nonsensical, a small portion of which was arguably defensible. And most of the bad things that he actually did do didn't even get the attention that they deserved because everybody was fixated on the frivolities. And so, notwithstanding that enormous disadvantage he was at, just in terms of the various components of society that were in vigorous opposition to him, he managed to get approximately 10 million more votes than he did in 2016. Think about that. Supposedly, this was the most horrifying, destructive presidency anyone could ever have imagined. Fascism, authoritarianism, literal Nazism, concentration camps, Russian agent, the whole kit and caboodle. We don't have to go down the list. And yet, Trump gets 10 million more votes than he did before. So, that gives you a little bit of insight into the lack of power that the opinion-making realms of society wield over the general populace. And yeah, did Biden ultimately win because he activated, or more voters were activated on his behalf? Yes, but when you take a holistic look, it's not as though that there's this unambiguous national consensus to repudiate Trump. Trump did lose, don't get me wrong. But it's not the kind of loss that would legitimize those who wielded the most insane possible tactics against him for 4 years straight nonstop. So I think that's a takeaway that you might have if you were thinking about the election rationally. But sadly, as I'm sure the comments in this video will demonstrate, the entire right of center media ecosystem is entirely engrossed by this notion that there was systematic, widespread fraud that changed the outcome. And so I foresee a number of years in the wilderness as they labor over these delusions, similarly to what happened in 2016 when the Democrats, in a not quite analogous way, but close enough, fostered the belief among their supporters that Trump had been illegitimately installed into power by a hostile foreign government, such that supermajorities of Democratic voters, if you look at a YouGov poll in 2018, believed not just that Russia, quote, interfered in the election, whatever the heck that meant, anyway, but that Russia tampered with the voting systems, tampered with the vote tallies to favor Trump and therefore illegitimately installed him into office. That's what was believed by Democrats. So we're getting into this cyclical routine where the losing side in American politics, on a presidential election level anyway, just cannot reconcile themselves to the reality of their defeat. So they develop these alternate epistemic habitats to dwell in that will provide them comfort and mollification so that they don't have to acknowledge reality. Um, and so, it's not a shock to me that the legitimacy of this outcome has just been rejected pretty much wholesale by Trump and huge portions of his supporters. It's a inevitability if you look at what happened in 2016, and I think this is part of the larger theme that I've described, which I think is fairly, uh, uh, which makes U.S. politics explicable. It's the corrosion of U.S. imperial hegemony. I'm sorry to sound melodramatic, but that's what you would expect to happen over the course of this erosion of America's hegemonic status. You'd expect this tit for tat where there's no consensus as to something so simple as an election outcome. Not that it's simple in a literalistic way, but it used to be like the province of consensus opinion as to who won what election. Now that's even up for contestation. And it is, to my knowledge, unprecedented for Trump to have not conceded in the manner that he did. And I don't think 2000 is not parallel here. That was one state that was undergoing a recount. Um, what Trump's doing here is different. And Hillary, for all her faults, she did concede in 2016, the following day after the election. Now, Democrats and people on her behalf, and operatives and pundits and voters and such, came up with all kind of cockamamie theories as to how the 2016 election was rigged. But Hillary herself did not, at least formally. I mean, she didn't formally dispute it. She had surrogates who did in various ways, but she did not. Whereas Trump is now saying just full out that the election is corrupted and rigged. And I strongly doubt that he'll ever admit defeat. I don't think he's planning a coup. I think that you have a lot of paranoia and uh, overinterpretation of various developments since the election to feed into this belief that there's something like a coup on the offing, and that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think they're just trying. People are just waiting it out, and I don't know, maybe giving Trump the emotional space to kind of accept what the reality is. Because look, I mean, if it were one state, if it were a margin of a couple hundred votes, then yeah, possibly some kind of systematic fraud could have been dispositive. But we're not talking about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona. That's just too much to be viable in terms of some kind of fraud claim. I think. But that's not to say you won't uncover individual instances of improprieties, especially if like you're really feverishly fishing for them, and you can get people to sign affidavits about somebody looking at them the wrong way in a polling society. I mean, that's a lot of what these lawsuits rely on. But I mean, look, the lawsuits are not even getting traction in the courts. I mean, don't rely on me. Go analyze the court proceedings. And in 2000, the Supreme Court didn't like just hand the election to Bush. They didn't declare Bush the winner. They ruled to stop a recount in Florida, which Democrats thought could have eventually shown Gore to be the winner in Florida. Like the Supreme Court can't like grant you votes or something. So if you want to live in this alternate ecosystem where suddenly, victory for Trump is going to descend from the heavens and everybody, Q is going to, I don't know, what, reign supreme, and Hillary's going to go to jail finally, whatever kind of whacked out worldview you inhabit, that's fine. I just think it's going to impede rational discussions as to the consequences of this election. And this election was very interesting in lots of ways. If you look at the map, the national map, it diverges from 2016 in a way that I actually discussed a little bit on the Tim Pool stream yesterday. And by the way, I don't agree with Tim Pool on a whole lot of stuff. I mean, he's an overt, unapologetic Trump supporter. That's fine. That's not my position. Never was. Never has been. But that doesn't preclude having a illuminating conversation with somebody. So that's just my attitude toward conversations with people in general, if within reason. Um, so yeah, I mean, if you look at the national map, there are some regional anomalies where the partisan skew in like um, Iowa. Hold on, let me pull up the map here one moment. I recommend taking a look at the New York Times map, which shows the shift from 2016. It's not complete because all the votes haven't been completed, but like there's like the one that's most confounding to me maybe is like Iowa and Minnesota. Like Iowa definitely lots of counties in Iowa that are demographically and politically similar to Minnesota trended heavily Republican, and then Trump won Iowa handily. Whereas counties like right across the border in Minnesota, which Trump and the Republicans thought for a while they could have won because of the riots and other issues, trended Democratic, and that to me is confounding. And I'm not suggesting a conspiracy. There's little basis for that. I'm just saying that because of the exponentially higher turnout in 2020 compared to 2016, I think you have, and because the turnout was across the board, it wasn't like a wave election for either party, really. It's created more of a muddle where it's harder to draw national conclusions about the trajectory of the turnout. Whereas in 2016, it was unambiguous. Um, the entire country was a sea of red in terms of the partisan shift. Not the entire country, but much of it. With the exception of, these metro areas, these affluent, suburban, prosperous metro areas that are increasingly where the Democratic Party relies upon for its national power. That's the reason why they'll have won Georgia, if that is officially called, which I'm assuming it probably will be relatively soon. Same for Arizona and other places. But it's more mixed and it's interesting and it's worth parsing in greater detail. But now we're like still enmeshed in this like multi-directional hysteria where you have the Trump opponents working themselves into a frenzy over some supposed coup because some personnel got changed out of the Defense Department and for other reasons that they're theorizing. And then you have the Trump supporters who like can't even get themselves beyond a mindset where everything is driven by fraud. Like nothing about this election is relevant to them analytically, politically, or otherwise, except for the fact that there was this massive, wide-scale fraud which changed the outcome. And if those are the worlds that you inhabit, then that's going to forestall any kind of thoroughgoing analysis of the nature of these election results. So I would encourage you to try to transcend that because it's ultimately a waste of time. And there will be much more to say about the election. You know, in 2016, I spent maybe a month or more, probably more, actually, you know, now that I think about it, analyzing the data from the election, emphasizing different things, and I really only touched on the tip of the iceberg here. So I'll be doing more of that um, in the future. Okay, so we're gonna go through some super chats. Thank you, as always, to my super chat contributors. STFUFFS says, when cases break for Trump, will you admit you're wrong? Why? Do you have like an oracle? Do you have a crystal ball? Do you know that the cases are going to break for Trump? If so, what's your basis for that? Because you saw some guy with a pseudonym on Twitter or Facebook or a YouTube comment saying it was so? Well, I mean, okay, so the onus is on you, buddy, because you're living a dreamland, not me. Let's see. My super chats are eluding me, which sometimes happens because Balakrishna says, "Love your work, but I think you're severely understating election fraud. The MCSC network has done a lot of work on election fraud." Okay, well, agree to disagree, because I think you could just say the word election fraud, not substantiate anything. Magically, election fraud that you posit exists happens to coincide with what your desires are for the election outcome, and it's just a hopeless, endless cycle. It's not for me to understate. It's based on evidence, and there isn't evidence for it in a systematic fashion. Is there election fraud or voter fraud that happens every cycle? Yes. But the burden is on you to demonstrate that the fraud is not just the individualized incidents that are inevitably going to happen. It's uh, it's just not there at all. And it's not just Democrats rigging it to say that; it's Republican officials in all these states saying it. So unless the Republicans who run Georgia are in on the conspiracy to deprive Trump of a second term, then the story just doesn't make sense. And again, it's not for me to disprove election fraud allegations. For you to prove them, and they haven't been proven. They've not been proven in these Trump campaign official legal filings that they're getting paid a ton of money to put out, and they're bilking people to contribute money for. Still, with these frantic fundraising solicitation emails that I still get. Okay, so somebody's mentioning that a man went to. So, again, nobody's disputing that voter fraud sometimes happens and is prosecuted. It's got to be systematic and coordinated in such a way, though, as to have affected the overall outcome of this race. And it hasn't. That has not been demonstrated. So you can live in your fantasy world if you want to. That's your prerogative. But there are more productive ways to spend your time and energy. Trump has lost the election. Sorry. And the sooner you reconcile yourself to that, the sooner you'll be able to develop a more informed view of the state of U.S. politics and move on. You know, maybe Trump will run again. I mean, he certainly would get the Republican nomination if he wanted to pursue that. Um, all right, everybody. Thank you for joining me. And we'll do it again soon. Once again, if you're interested, go seek out that Tim Pool stream, if you so please. Krillin asked, did you see my comment? Are you going on B. Weinstein? I haven't been invited to my knowledge. I'd do it if he asked. So if you would like to see that for whatever reason, then you can pose the question to him. And if I missed his email or something, or you know something more than I do, let me know and I'll look into it. Okay, looks like I got another. All right, that's it. All right, you know the deal, everybody. Stay safe, stay cool, etc. Stay sane in the midst of the all-consuming post-election insanity that's largely propaganda designed to manipulate you emotionally. Bye bye.